I was a young girl, when I was a kid, I remember my mother seemed to talk without even having to breathe. If she'd been interested in sports, she would have been a great play-by-play announcer. Over breakfast every morning, she would often relate entire movies to me that she had watched the night before on the Late Show. He said, then she said, then they said, and he did, and she did, and on and on and on and on. And while at one level, I thought that this had made me a great listener, I also found myself as an adult often joking that listening, or rather not really listening, to my mother's monologues, as I like to call them, helped me develop the skill of being able to tune out any auditory distractions. Gradually, over time, though, what came to be included in auditory distractions was anything that seemed trivial, not to be of immediate self-centered interest, or that was in disagreement with my current thinking. What I really learned was how to zone out, how to disconnect from my own experience as well as that of others. When I originally wrote this talk on deep hearing, I commented on how ironic it was that I chose a career as a psychologist that largely involves listening to people. But as I reread this, I thought, wow, how perfect that was as a way to heal myself and learn how to really listen and hear. And I can remember one of my earliest experience in psychology school was being taught active listening. I was really bored with that idea. It was way too simple. You just listened and repeated back what you had heard. Anybody can do that. It was just this cognitive exercise. Hadn't I learned this over and over again in my mother's presence as a child? How silly. I wasn't going to be a psychologist just to listen and connect with people. I was going to have special, expert knowledge. I wasn't just going to listen to people. I was going to interpret how they were really thinking and feeling, not what they were telling me. And as Bill says, I'm a pretty slow learner. So it only took me about 20 years or so to figure out that being an expert isn't all it's cracked up to be, and to appreciate the beginner's mind perspective. And I love the quote, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's, only few. And I didn't see how I was narrowing down my possibilities by trying to be an expert rather than seeing each moment as new and fresh and wondrous. Clearly, I was quite lost in my own ego-based delusions and ignorance. The search for special knowledge, skills, and ego-centered wisdom applied not only to my professional life, but to my personal and spiritual life. At some point, I began my spiritual search, which led me to Buddhism and meditation. I was looking for answers, for meaning, for a way to be at peace, to not suffer. And I tried various forms of meditation and kept looking for a teacher to tell me what to do and how to do it. I would generally get pretty excited about a new practice, a new teacher, a new group, and then sometimes slowly or more quickly, I'd get frustrated and discouraged. The practice was too cumbersome, or it just didn't seem to be working. I wasn't achieving enlightenment quickly enough. I was never going to get there. The teacher was flawed. The teaching wasn't working. It never occurred to me that I just wasn't listening deeply enough. Or perhaps that I was only listening through my limited ego-based self. And to be honest, I was mostly doing this by myself as a bookstore Buddhist. I wasn't getting any feedback from teachers, actually. I was just reading their books, listening to their audios, not really interacting with people who might be able to help me feel this through. That's not to say that I didn't get anything from these years of searching and trying. I practiced compassion towards myself and others. I learned some really difficult lessons in humility through making my own mistakes. I practiced with the notion of surrender, and goodness knows I was trying to listen and really hear what messages the universe was trying to tell me. I mostly expected those to come on a big truck with loudspeakers yelling at me in the streets, Lori, do this, go this way. But that never really happened. I think enough of it got through, though, so that when I finally encountered a Shin Buddhist community in Connecticut, and Shin Buddhism, many people aren't familiar with it. It's a Mahayana practice and somewhat developed later, I don't know, the 13th, 14th century, around the same time as Zen, by a monk, Shinran Shonin, who spent many years in one of the most prestigious monasteries in Japan, and eventually gave up. He felt he was a complete failure. He was never going to be a monk. He couldn't get those stringent meditation practices. They just weren't working for him. And feeling like a failure, he left the monastery, but found a teacher, Honin, who was really focused on a perspective that can be used by non-monastics. Not the rigorous meditations for hours, but something that householders could do. And that so resonates with Bill and Susan's approach to how do we bring this into our ordinary everyday lives? How do we practice with all the other busyness and responsibilities of our lives? So still really resonates with me. And so I was ready at that point to put my ego a little bit aside. And what I really loved was the idea of Shinran that we're all foolish beings, or Bompo. And boy, did that resonate with me. By that point, I was ready to accept what a foolish critter I was. And I didn't have all the answers, or maybe even any of the answers. There's no pressure to become the perfect meditator, to even achieve some special level of enlightenment. Whew, I could relax. I didn't have to be anticipating where I needed to be and judging myself for that. And as I began to study the Dharma in community, one concept that made sense to me was this concept of deep hearing, or Mompo. And Jeff Wilson, who's a Shin Buddhist scholar, states in Buddhism of the Heart that this is not a practice. Rather, it is a putting aside of my ego ears, of my own limited self-based striving, so that I can allow the Dharma, mindfulness, to work through me. This deep hearing is not simply an auditory experience, but rather, as another Shin scholar, Tetsuya Uno, puts it, this is an experiential awakening of the total self, body, heart, mind. Hear the echoes of Bill and Susan there? Deep hearing is an opening of my whole self to the embodied experience of mindfulness, of being in this body, in this moment. In other words, through the working of sati, or mindfulness, I'm open to hearing in the depths of my being, to the core of my being, in a truly embodied experience of our interbeing. And as Susan would say, set aside my little Lori perspective and allow mindfulness to come to the fore. This is the practice of appreciative listening. Listening with deep appreciation for the other human being, I'm in the presence of and our common humanity, listening with the heart in a way that allows that speaker to feel valued and truly understood. In other words, listening with the ears of Metta, with loving kindness. This is our Sangha practice. This is what we offer when we have our small Sangha groups once a month. This is the time to practice appreciative, deep listening to each other, with each other, practicing deep valuing, listening with our whole beings, and speaking with our whole voice, and appreciatively, deeply hearing and being heard. When I originally wrote this, one thing that came to mind was the old and now even older Jim Carrey movie, Bruce Almighty. If you haven't seen it, it's a movie where Jim Carrey as Bruce gets all the powers of God. And there's a scene that I love when God, in the form of Morgan Freeman, who else, gives Bruce his powers. Bruce has no idea what he's in for. He's thinking, well, this being God would be cool. After all, how hard can it be since God doesn't seem to be doing all that well running things anyway? Does that resonate with any way people are feeling today? You know, if there's any higher force in the universe, get to work. Do something about all this pain and suffering. But when Bruce actually gets these powers, he begins to hear all of the prayers and petitions of every person on earth. And he begins to realize what it means to begin to be awake. I realize that this is what it feels like to be aware of the pain and suffering in our world today. It can be overwhelming. As Lama Rod Owens describes, people come to me and say, oh, this practice that you gave me, it hasn't helped me to feel good. He says, I get it, because when I started my practice, it didn't feel good either. I felt as if I was suffering more. I wasn't. I was just finally paying attention. And he says, this may not be fun, but it definitely gets better if we hold the course. We learn to be patient with ourselves, with others, with the whole of humanity. We're all slow learners with everything that arises. We learn little by little to love it all into the arms of mindfulness. So I deeply thank my mother for her patience with me. I can now listen more deeply to her teachings, even though she's no longer with us. And I can understand her desire to share, to connect. I can appreciate her teachings about how to love the world we are in. I'm slowly and sometimes painfully learning to embrace my mother and all of those who just want to be heard with loving kindness and patience. And my heart bursts open with deep hearing, deep entrusting, and deep kindfulness. So thank you so much for your patience and your deep listening to my words.